Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations number 32. I'm your host, Joe Hannon, Joe from Jersey, the guy behind BJJ Meditations, the guy who's getting his black belt this Saturday. Be sure to do an episode in the future about that. Naturally, I have some thoughts about that major life transition. Some of those thoughts will show up in this week's meditation, but just much of where my head's at in terms of getting the black belt has less to do with my evolution on the mats and more to do with my evolution off the mats. Like, I think about who I was when I started training jiu-jitsu versus who I am now. And there's so much growth that has happened that I don't think would have otherwise happened. And I'm just supremely grateful for that. I hope to go a bit deeper on that, but for now I have some other things I want to talk about. First is this crazy experience I had. I guess it was Thursday night. We put my son to bed at the usual time around 6:30, and he woke up around 11 o'clock, just as I was getting to sleep after a night of hard training, and he was crying, which is unusual for him. He's a very good sleeper. I went in, I rubbed his back. He went back to sleep, and then not 5 minutes later, he was just distraught. I went back in the room and he was just gasping for air. So my mind is immediately cycling through all the potentials of what is this? Is this pneumonia? Is this asthma? Do we need to go to the hospital? And I'm looking at him struggle to breathe. And I decide, we're going to the hospital. Woke up my wife and we got him to the hospital. And fortunately there was a pediatric emergency medicine physician on staff that night in the ER. And she just took one look at him and she was like, it's croup. It's no big deal. Just, we're going to give him a steroid and here's this other medication to give him when you get home, and just monitor, and he should feel better in a few days. He might spike a fever, which he did. Just very late night for all of us, very terrifying night. I mean, I was driving to get to the hospital in my Subaru Crosstrek at Formula One speed, running red lights. Luckily, there was no one else on the road. And I just had done the calculus of like, okay, it's probably going to take X amount of minutes to get an ambulance here versus it's going to take X amount of minutes to get to the hospital. So we're going to the hospital, but he's fine now. He's doing much better. He's in daycare today. And I shared this little story just to kind of illustrate the point I made about jiu-jitsu transforming your life thematically. Like, I don't think that, first of all, I should say that I have, for somebody who's not, a trained clinician in any capacity, I have a decent amount of clinical knowledge and skill. Some of that's just from being in Boy Scouts, and a lot of that's from having a nurse for a mother and just absorbing a lot of knowledge from her. And then also for years I was a journalist covering medicine and healthcare, writing about really like clinical stuff and writing for physicians. So not a whole lot of room for error there. So I've amassed like a decent amount of knowledge of how the body works. I feel like maybe I could pass for like a second year nursing student or something like that. So drawing on that information kind of helped me keep a level head in that situation. But even more so than that, I think just the calmness under pressure certainly was a byproduct of the training I've done on the mats for the past 8 years now. And to just kind of be able to approach that situation as dispassionately as possible, simultaneously like feeling that very real existential fear for my son's life, but kind of being able to hold it at arm's length a bit and act as I needed to act to address the situation. I attribute that directly to my training on the mats. So I say this again and again, like, we train jiu-jitsu, we can train it to train the martial art in isolation, but really the gift is so much larger than that. So, and also, this whole experience really has me thinking once again about what's important, what really matters. And I think many of you would agree that what really matters is the people we love. And jiu-jitsu is kind of secondary to that, but it's also just a powerful lens for studying and examining all these things. But would 10 out of 10 times choose save my son's life in that scenario. Just a really rough couple days in general, but kind of coming back up to speed here and finally feeling like I'm in a mind space where I can even think conceptually about jiu-jitsu. So with that being said, here is BJJ Meditations number 32. It's called The Line. A line separates our training from ordinary life. This was a concept that came up in a recent Andrew Huberman Lab episode. On one side of the line is the time we have devoted to training. Everything else falls on the other side. Prior to crossing the line into the training zone, we have done the mental and physical homework that optimal training requires. We have chosen what we will emphasize in our training. We have chosen what we will eat and when, how we will hydrate. We have chosen what, if anything, we will listen to while we train to keep the phone checks to a minimum. Maybe we take this to an extreme. We carefully fold our gi, belt, and rash guard hours before training. We pack our training bags with the same love and care that we use to pack our children's lunches. Maybe we carry this into our strength and conditioning work. We lay out our gym clothes the night before. Our breakfast is already made in the refrigerator. The coffee pot is set to brew the moment we rise. We step into the gym and the phone goes on Do Not Disturb for an hour. Maybe we do this so consistently and with such great focus that the line begins to fade. Maybe our entire life becomes a life of training. Yeah, so to kind of circle back to the beginning of this idea of the line, I think that especially among lower belts, even among some middle belts and upper belts, there's this tendency to think of jiu-jitsu as a service rendered. I think that tendency is becoming less and less as the years go by, simply because the internet has democratized the flow of information writ large, but also in jiu-jitsu. For example, you can very well go and be your own jiu-jitsu coach with some degree of success just by studying instructionals, having a place to train, and having someone to train with. That breeds this whole larger question of what is the role of jiu-jitsu in modern times when that's a service that's available to us. But that's a subject for another conversation. Jiu-jitsu, though, is not a service rendered. And I think that's the case even at the levels of lower belts. You're not simply showing up and purchasing jiu-jitsu knowledge. There's a participation that has to happen. There's a give and take, a reciprocity that has to happen there between you and your instructor. There's work that has to happen on the mat, and that might be on the mat and off the mat. And that might be as simple as taking the time to set your intentions before training. It might be something as simple as making sure your mind and body are optimally prepared for training. But this all became super salient to me during the pandemic as I observed our head coach, Shane McCarthy at Princeton Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Colin Weimer, his friend, and how seriously they took their training during the pandemic and how they just owned it. You know, the school was closed at a point in time when it became sort of apparent that it was safe to train, but the school couldn't legally open. They were working so hard and so focused, but practicing deliberately, really honing their game from a first principles standpoint. They went super deep on acquiring whatever the latest thinking was, pressure testing it, really building their games up from the ground up kind of on their own terms. And this is after having done numerous years of deliberate practice and focus and study within the walls of the school. They at no point were like, we don't need this anymore. We're done with formal training. I think if they were on the show, they would say that's kind of absurd, but they illustrated to me in a totally clear capacity how important that ownership of our development is. I recall when the school finally opened and I was finally able to train with them. My wife was pregnant with my son at the time, so I only was training with two other people who were vaccinated, both of whom were, one of whom was in academic medicine and the other whom was in law enforcement agents. So they had early access to the vaccine. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to train with these guys. I'm not going to train with anyone else. Finally, I got my vaccine and I was able to train with the general population again. And prior to that, you know, Shane has always been, you know, a much better grappler than me. Colin, to a degree, has always been better than me. But the gap between our skill sets widened in a way that was just impossible to ignore during those months of the pandemic. And it was just because of the depth and the focus and the ownership that they brought to their jiu-jitsu that I previously had not brought. So yeah, that really kind of showed me the way to grow. It really showed me that I had to own my game to the same extent that they owned their game. And that became a big mission of my my purple belt, my brown belt, and that kind of seems to be like my life's work now as I'm a black belt, right? Like I'm going to be a black belt for the rest of my life. That's not to say that I don't have anything to learn from Emily Kwok, my head instructor, or from my head coach, Coach Shane, or from Colin, or from anyone in the school. That's to the contrary. But I've really come to appreciate how I need to be in the driver's seat of that learning process. And I think this idea of the line just encapsulates that perfectly. Like, we might be, let's use the example of strength and conditioning. Like, we might be relying on somebody to do our strength and conditioning programming for us. We might be relying on them to watch footage of our movement and evaluate it for form, or to be in the room with us. But there's so much more we can do to make sure that that time and that money is well spent. And no one's going to do that for us. So I guess this all begs the question of, what does this look like if I'm a brand new student in jiu-jitsu? Like, how can I own things on my side of the line before I step into that training zone side of the line? I don't know anything. Let's say you're a brand new white belt. You don't even know how to tie your belt. I think a good way of framing this is to just create that ready state, that ability to perform. You ideally, maybe you don't know yet, maybe part of your journey through the martial arts or whatever you're training, if you're listening to this podcast, is figuring out who you are as a performer. And what do I mean by that? I mean, what do you need to perform optimally? Like, for example, I, was an amateur musician. I guess I still am an amateur musician. I play these instruments you see behind me, but I played as a solo musician for a number of years, and I played in some bands too. And my optimal performance state was like 2.5 Jack Daniels on the rocks. That was enough alcohol to get me out of my head, so I wasn't self-conscious of my playing or my singing. And it was not so much that my playing and singing deteriorated, or at least deteriorated to a point where people would notice. Granted, not the most wholesome example, folks. I don't recommend you turn to alcohol to kill the pre-jiu-jitsu jitters or the pre-performance jitters. But hey, like rock and roll, that's part of the lifestyle, and that's what I did, and it worked really well for me. But now, my pre-performance state in jiu-jitsu, it has a lot to do with like, okay, how well did I sleep the night before? There's so much I can do to make sure that I'm setting the stage for good sleep. What did I eat? When did I eat it? How hydrated am I? Did I take electrolytes before I went to bed, or did I take electrolytes first thing in the morning? Like, these are all things that, like, especially if you listen to the Huberman Lab, you can get a lot of insights as to where and when and which levers to pull. But a lot of that's going to be preferential. There are a number of people in our schools who prefer to train fasted. There are other people who need to have some sort of a snack or a meal before training. But this is all stuff you need to figure out. And I think that the psychological side of things tends to get ignored a bit too. Like, I know that when I'm really consistent with my meditation practice, when I'm really consistent with my HRV breathing work, when I'm really consistent with my MIQ process, which I talked about on the last episode, I'm going to be more attentive and more present to my training sessions, and I'm going to pick up on things that otherwise would get missed. And guess what? Like, this is all stuff you can do as a white belt on up to black belt. Like, you don't really need any sort of jiu-jitsu specific knowledge to do these things. But ultimately, it's about how you show up and how you present and prepare yourself before you cross the line. And the other side of that is, what does this look like for the more advanced student? It's all of that plus self-coaching. Like, I think that really by the time I got to purple belt, I really had a good idea of who I was as a grappler. And what I mean by that is I knew what stuff I was drawn to. I knew what stuff I was not drawn to. I knew where the gaps were in my game. Obviously, I'm still in the process of having more of those gaps revealed. Nobody is a perfect feedback loop unto themselves, but I kind of had some semblance of what I needed to work on and where I wanted to grow and where my current depth of skill was. So you can do a lot of good with that knowledge. You can really start to lean into things like studying instructionals and studying footage of yourself rolling. All of that is going to propel your growth in a way that it might not for a lower belt who just doesn't have the technical acumen or background. But that's not to say for the lower belt that there isn't utility in watching those instructionals. It's kind of I think for the lower belt there's more of an onus there to hold things a bit loosely since you don't have a ton of background knowledge to draw from. But the upper belts, like, absolutely. I think the earlier you start doing that, the stronger your game is going to be in the long run. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind, and this is a pattern that I've seen typically at blue belts, right around when they disappear and are never to be seen again. You do need a coach. You do need feedback loops. You do need training partners who are going to push you and expose your vulnerabilities, but you need a coach and you need feedback loops to reflect on those vulnerabilities and to figure out how to close those gaps. This is not a sport for lone wolves. We definitely are tribal animals as human beings, and we're tribal animals on and off the mat. So you need a strong tribe, and your tribe needs a strong leader in order to thrive and to make sure that everybody grows to their level. So if you don't have those ingredients in place, you need to get them. You need to make decisions about how you're going to get them. But I think the overall point of this meditation, if it has a point, as these rambles tend to go, is that, in the end, when I say maybe we do this so consistently and with such great focus that the line begins to fade, maybe our entire life becomes a life of training. I think that's the objective. We create these walls and these distinctions in our life, this and that, training, not training. But I have found that the more I grow as a person, as a grappler, the less meaningful these distinctions are. A classic distinction is the distinction between your personal life and your professional life. Well, Jiu Jitsu, really, like my professional life as a consultant, has roots in Jiu Jitsu. And every year that's gone by, that line between personal and professional has gotten more and more blurry. Like, this thing that I love now is an indispensable part of how I put food on the table, how I develop myself so that I can serve clients better. And I have mixed feelings about that. I'm not going to lie. Like, that sort of childlike wonder that I once brought to the game isn't there anymore. There's something that's less naive and more mature. But it just makes me feel more whole. Like, it feels like everything, all of my intentions and all the things I do and everything I think and everything I feel is kind of like more aligned than it used to be. So I think that's what I mean when I said, your entire life becomes a life of training. And that's the beauty of this sport, is that you can really funnel it into your life writ large. The thematic training that I keep talking about, the ability for me to keep a clear and level head when my son was sick and I had no idea what was going on, or the ability for me to take the feedback loops that I've constructed on the mat and apply them to my writing, or apply them to how I'm trying to grow my businesses, or applying them to how I relate to the people I love. All of these things tie back to how and why I train, and how and why I train on the mat is how and why I train at these other things as well. And, to borrow an idea from Jocko Willink, I think that this disciplined approach to training, this towing that line and eventually the disappearance of that line, that's the discipline that gives us freedom. When that distinction is gone, when I am the same person that is on the mat as I am off the mat, that's true freedom. That's freedom of expression. That's freedom of optimal performance. I am this person regardless of what the domain that I'm in. And I think that the true fascinating, beautiful souls that I've met in my life have that quality to them. And I think that's something for all of us to strive for. But ultimately, you need to train at something to get to that position. And certainly for you all who are listening to this podcast, BJJ is that something, but I think that something could be almost anything. It could be rock climbing, it could be darts, it could be archery, it could be curling. You know, if curling sets your soul on fire, and if curling reveals deficiencies in your being, which I'm sure it does, I've never had the pleasure of curling, then hey, curling can be your thing too. But you need to have a thing, and you need to have a thing that brings you to that line, and eventually you train that thing enough and the line disappears, and you are that same organized, principled, structured, effective human being inside and outside of that domain. So I think that's about all I have to say this week. Really appreciate you guys continuing to listen, support, read, try to give you options in terms of how this thing is consumed. If you want to read the essays, they're all on Mirror. There's a link there in the show notes that'll take you to Mirror. Mirror is a blogging platform that's on the Ethereum blockchain. If you want to support the podcast, you can buy an NFT of one of these episodes. They're priced for about $15 a piece. Eventually I'm going to do something. I had somebody write me on Instagram and say, hey, is there any utility to holding the NFTs? And yeah, I think eventually I'm going to do something utility related. Like, for example, if you hold a certain NFT, you might get access to an event or merch or something like that. But all the stuff that's out already, that's just purely a way to financially support the podcast if you feel so moved. But don't feel pressured at all to support the podcast, guys. If you love it and you want to support it, wonderful. I'd say this is, as I've said over and over and over again, this is always going to be a free resource for you, whether it's the writing or the podcast itself. And any money that we do make as a business, as BJJ Meditations, 1% of all proceeds will go to some cause to be determined that has environmental implications. At least 1%. The goal is to get more than that over time. And that includes any consulting services. Like if you choose to work with me in a coaching capacity, 1% of that, with the goal of getting to more of that, will go toward an environmental cause. But financially, if you don't want to support the podcast, totally cool. The best thing you can do is like, subscribe, review, and share on whatever platform that you're consuming this. It's on every podcasting platform under the sun, and it's on YouTube too. You can follow on Instagram. I try to post some clips every now and then. It's Instagram's a funny game. A lot of times I feel like I'm just wasting my time putting stuff up there, but maybe it's useful for you guys. I don't know, but that's the best way to keep up with any happenings, with the podcast or with BJJ Meditations. Speaking of which, for those of you who are BJJ Mental Models premium subscribers, Emily Kwok and I are going to be doing a limited series on BJJ Mental Models. Episode 1 just dropped. You need to be a premium member of BJJ Mental Models to listen to it. And I believe Steve is offering I think there's a free, no obligation 7-day trial for premium. So if you want to hear what Emily and I talked about with one of our students, go over to BJJ Mental Models and sign up for a trial on premium. We had a great discussion about pedagogy, why and how we teach Jiu Jitsu, and where we can improve, both as students and as professors. Professor, I don't know if that term applies to me. I don't know I'm just Joe. I'm just Joe. If you want to train with me, you don't need to call me Coach Joe. You don't need to call me Professor. Just call me Joe, please. Anyway, if you want to work with me in a consulting capacity, that's honestly the thing that I enjoy most doing. And contact me. The email is in the show notes. We can schedule a consultation and figure out even if I can help you. Maybe I can. I'll be the first to say, no, I can't help you with that. You should probably go to someone else. This is a bullshit-free zone. Also read on Substack. Link to Substack is in the show notes. That's more life-related writing. And finally, please feel free to come train at Princeton Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Come through anytime. We welcome all ranks from all schools. As long as you're a good human being and you don't have a smelly gi, you can come train with us. We'd love to talk to you in person, hear what you're getting out of BJJ Meditations, and just learn more about you and why you came into Jiu-Jitsu in the first place. Anyway, that about wraps it up. Thank you very much, guys. Hope you're all staying comfortable in this crazy, humid, hot weather we're having here in the Northeast and the West and pretty much everywhere in the world, because we're in the thick of this climate disaster thing. Anyway, talk soon.